Thanks, Chair, and thank you all for the presentations. Obviously, assuming that everybody here accepts the science of climate change, I think if you were able to be honest, and you probably can't say what I can say, that this is quite depressing, this National Mitigation Plan. It doesn't do anything to really get us to where we need to be. And the projection given by the EPA on page 8 of your presentation is really frightening, and I assume scientifically absolutely accurate, but it's very frightening when you look at that graph and see how we came from 1990 being at this level of CO2 emissions per tonne, go up during the boom, back down again during the recession. We're beginning to climb again. The last figure we have is for 2016, but look at where we need to be by 2050, right down here at 5 megatons. And how the hell are we going to get there when we can say here today, or it has been said here today, it is not possible to set out a plan to 2050. It's a working document. I can see why it's not possible. And I'll tell you what illustrated it to me most of all in the last couple of weeks was the very excited announcement by the Minister for Agriculture of a new deal with China for thousands and thousands of more cattle. A new deal for thousands and thousands of tonnes worth of dairy products. And then quickly following on that, the discussion in the Dáil and the debate among the farmers on the fodder crisis. We had a fodder crisis because climate change had meant that it rained very heavily, not just this winter, but the last winter. We have a fodder crisis because the big producers are buying up all the fodder when the climate responds like this. And then the family farmers can't manage to feed their cattle. Cattle are dying, but yet these family farmers, and they admitted it to us, are coming under increased pressure all the time from the department, from their own organisations, to grow more cattle and grow more dairy cows because the market is dictating the pace. And I can see why the market is attractive. It's certainly not attractive to family farmers in this situation, but it is attractive to the mega producers. But unless there's a plan where departments speak to each other and where the economy has some level of grip about what is happening with climate change. And obviously, coming from the left as I do, I have more interest in planned economy that doesn't allow the free market to reign supreme. But I think at some point, the free marketeers, unless they're going to destroy the planet and bring us to the point of where climate change there's just no return from it, are going to have to sit up and take notice. And this is why I'd love to see us having a minister and a department that screamed at other ministers and departments, stop doing this. We need to talk to each other, join the dots and plan this out together. And I believe that you guys must be extraordinarily frustrated and angry that that isn't happening, because you're all scientists and you all know what's going on. But just a couple of specific questions for the department. Why is it that the national policy position doesn't mention industry, manufacturing and waste and other types of energy emissions? Why is it left out of it altogether? And I'm not going to make any assumptions why that is, but could you expand on it a little bit? And then I would like for the discussion around transport to be teased out a bit, because I hear other deputies talking about the need for non-diesel buses, for example, but to be honest, I think the real problem is in the amount of private cars on the road, and that the amount of emissions from private transport is much higher than the emissions from public transport. And if we could even reduce the private use of cars on the road to a fraction, we would be doing our emissions a huge favour. You'd only have to be on the M50 early in the morning to see gridlock on a 4-lane motorway in both directions to understand that the private use of cars is way out of proportion. And again, I think the reason for that is bad planning. That when industry and homes and estates are built, planners don't take into account, the developers don't take into account the need for transport hubs to be nearby. Yes, it's in the planning development plan of a council or a county council, because I've been a councillor and we sat there working out all these plans for transport hubs, but it's never implemented in a reasonable way that takes private cars off the road in big numbers. And I'd like if the EPA and others could comment about that, and maybe you don't see it as your role of commenting of it. And final question to you all is, I know it might be seen as a gesture, but would the organisations here, including the department, support the bill on climate emergency measures to leave fossil fuels in the ground, which we have before committee in July? And would you see that as a measure that would be positive in terms of contributing to reducing the CO2 emissions, and at least sending out a signal that we need to wake up, smell the coffee and take this thing serious, because there is nothing in this that really shows us that we're plotting and managing our what's gone off the radar in terms of our emissions. And I think the EPA's graph says it all. Everybody should look at that. It's quite startling.
Thank you, Deputy. Deputy Ryan, do you want to come in now?
Yeah. One of the things she asked was around the question of industry and so on. The focus in terms of the National Mitigation Plan, Ireland's legally binding obligations arise in the non-ETS sector. Agriculture accounts for 45% of our non-ETS emissions. When you add transport emissions in, that brings us up to 73% of non-ETS emissions. So the focus on agriculture and transport in particular, and then when you bring in the built environment, you're dealing with the bulk of the problem at that point in terms of where emissions are coming from. There are emissions from manufacturing, combustion and industrial processes from a variety of sources, and they are in the main regulated under the EU ETS system. That's a cap and trade, so there's no legal obligation on the state. It's up to the installations to manage their emissions and to buy and sell allowances. Then maybe coming back to Deputy Ryan, and I might, after that, National Development Plan commits to a step up in sustainable travel measures, comprehensive cycling and walking network for metropolitan areas and expanded greenways. That's in the National Development Plan. In terms of buses, the transition to low emission, including electric buses for the urban public bus fleet with no diesel-only buses purchased from the 1st of July 2019, is in the National Development Plan. And I think decarbonising our public transport is very important in cities for air quality reasons as well, and also to bring about the necessary modal shift. But again, in terms of the scales of challenges, 4% of our transport emissions come from public passenger journeys, over 50% come from private car journeys. So that's where, I mean, a big issue lies. I think in terms of the retrofitting houses, I'd fully agree with Deputy Ryan. I think 45,000
existing infrastructure. I think I'm going to seek into one of Deputy Smith's queries or points that was raised earlier that I don't particularly disagree with, frankly. Transport planning is a spatial planning challenge, I suppose, at its root. It's spatial, it's socio-economic, and it's transport planning. By the time you get to discussion around let's switch it from diesel and petrol to electricity, you're asking the wrong question. It is the number of people having to drive in a car to a place. So I was very thankful and very heartened by the fact that there were things coming out of the Citizens' Assembly, such as a switch towards public transport from perhaps roads infrastructure, and a tendency in that direction. And separately, also in the Capital Development Plan, we have to acknowledge the fact that it did look at more sustainable forms of transport and modal shift away from cars. Because by the time it gets to my door, we're answering the wrong question. We're mitigating a symptom as opposed to anything else. In terms of a couple of other specific points,
yeah, just a couple of comments. Just in relation to what Deputy Smith was asking, like I'm glad you pointed out our graph. Like we consider that to be a particularly important graph because it is stark and it really does show the scale of the challenge, and it also shows the reversal of the trend of what had been happening for whatever reason in the period before the current period. So the point I just wanted to make there is that the EPA will be continuing to report annually on both the emissions inventories and the projections. And as Dr. Cotter referred to, we will only be using the information that is verifiable in developing the projections in particular. you know, and then this business about it being absolutely crucial that the things that are set out in the plan and also in the National Development Plan actually get implemented, and that as those plans start to evolve and develop, they will then find their way into our projections. Obviously, the obverse, if they don't happen, then they won't find their way into our projections, and the projections will continue to portray the kind of picture that's presented in that figure. The other thing that we'll be doing, we produce a State of the Environment report every 4 years, and we're required by the EPA Act to do that. And the last report was in 2016. We've started work now on the next one, which will be for 2020. In the 2016 report, we looked in some detail at energy, transport and agriculture, and we included in the paper just a summary of the key messages from those chapters for those 3 particular sectors. And the collaboration issue came up. Collaboration is just hugely important in this area, that all the different state agencies are collaborating and working together in this. Like, it's just huge. Like, we do work in other areas, like, for example, the Water Framework Directive, which is just looking at water. It's complicated enough to get everybody to collaborate in a space like that. This is covering the entire economy and society, so it's very, very complicated. So the structures, I think the collaborative structures are being put in place, and they do take time to bed in as well. But it's about, you know, building the structures that enable all the different departments and agencies to work together on a common goal. In terms of, I think it was Deputy